The city library was my sanctuary, a place I often returned to when the world seemed too noisy and my thoughts too restless. Here, among the tall wooden shelves hidden in the shadows, and the scent of old, yellowing pages, I found what I sought: peace and solitude. On this day, just like every other, I felt the warm sun shining through the large windows, gently touching my hair and face. It caressed me softly, making me forget about time. I immersed myself in the world of novels, searching for a book I hadn't read yet. Something in this section beckoned me, something romantic, elusive, but irresistibly attractive. I was rummaging through the books when suddenly something interrupted me: a soft knock, the sound of falling pages, as though the very atmosphere of the library had started to move. I looked up and met the gaze of a man. Our faces were almost an inch apart. I recoiled, stunned by this unexpected encounter, and found that I had knocked several books out of his hands. He stood before me with brown eyes full of mirth, and slightly tousled chestnut hair, which, though it could have appeared disheveled, perfectly matched his charm. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I stammered, blushing with embarrassment. "I didn't notice." "It's fine," he smiled, his eyes sparkling with genuine amusement. "I'm Durant," he added, extending his hand. "Sylvia," I replied, cautiously shaking his hand. As we gathered the books, our fingers brushed accidentally, and I felt a small electric jolt. In that moment, I couldn't help but notice the blush that quickly colored his cheeks. I wasn't sure if he felt the same, but his face conveyed something familiar and warm. "Are you always so absorbed in choosing books?" Durant broke the silence, nodding towards the stack of books I was holding. I laughed, feeling a slight awkwardness. "Only when I can't decide what to read next." "And you? What brought you here?" He paused for a moment, then replied with a hint of reproach in his voice. "I'm looking for a good book. For me, it's more than just a hobby." Our conversation, which had started with trivialities, quickly turned into a deeper exchange. We talked about books, ideas, and dreams, about how important it is to have something that helps you escape and delve deep into a world of fantasy. I was surprised at how easily and naturally the conversation flowed, as if we had known each other for a long time, though we had never met before. Soon, despite still trying to choose books, we abandoned our search and found a secluded spot in the library cafe. Hours flew by unnoticed. The coffee cooled, but our conversation grew more candid. We talked not only about literature but also about favorite foods, travel dreams, and odd hobbies. I found it hard to pinpoint what exactly attracted me to him most: his sincerity, his extraordinary openness, or the mysterious depth hidden behind his words. It was all so captivating that time ceased to exist. "I've always liked this library," Durant confessed, glancing around with a nostalgic smile, as if reliving childhood memories. "I used to come here with my mom," he added, his gaze becoming distant and his voice softened. "She used to read to me." "Sounds wonderful," I said, feeling my thoughts drift into my own childhood memories. "It must have been a magical time." Durant didn't reply right away. He seemed to retreat into himself, his expression becoming slightly contemplative. I sensed there was something more behind his words. It was something inexpressible, unsaid, something that made me wonder about his past and try to unravel the mysteries of his silence. "Everything changes," he finally said, with a slight trace of sadness in his voice. "Everything always changes." These words left a weight in the air that hadn't been there before. I felt my interest in his life, in his world, growing stronger. But before I could ask my question, he interrupted me again. "But no matter what happens, sometimes encounters like this give hope." I don't know how, but I felt there was something more in these words than just a casual meeting. Time passed, and we left the library, leaving behind a promise to meet again. Since the day Durant and I became inseparable, every one of our dates felt like an exploration, not only of new places we visited but also of new worlds we uncovered for each other. We shared dreams and worries, laughed and sat in silence, and our bond grew stronger, like fabric weaving itself from threads of mutual respect and love. Time passed quickly, and then came that day, the day I became his wife. It felt as if the entire world paused for a moment, and I was part of something grand and eternal. But amidst all the joy and excitement, one figure stood out, a shadow casting its darkness over our happiness. Durant's mother, Mrs. Wanda, was always around, but her presence did not bring me comfort. Her sharp gaze seemed to pierce my soul, and while her smile often appeared on her face, it never reached her eyes. I tried not to pay attention to it, hoping that over time she would see how deeply Durant and I loved each other and accept our union. But this hope, as it turned out, was soon to be seriously tested. When we found out we were expecting a child, joy overwhelmed me, but along with it came unpleasant sensations. Every morning was a battle with nausea, and by evening I was exhausted. Durant was always there, supporting me in every possible way, but I could see how anxiously he watched over me. He felt my condition even more strongly than I did. He couldn't remain indifferent. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, when I could barely hold back my tears, he spoke carefully. "Sylvia, maybe we should consider getting closer to my family for a while, until the baby arrives." I hesitated. Durant's house had always been a place I perceived as foreign and cold. Getting closer to his family meant being closer to Wanda. I couldn't shake the thought that it would be hard there, that her disapproving gaze would never leave me for a moment. "Do you think it's a good idea?" I asked, trying to hide the uncertainty in my voice. Durant took my hand, his fingers gently squeezing mine, and his voice became quieter, warmer. "It's just a thought. My mom raised 3 kids. She could help with things for the baby and, more importantly, support you when I'm at work." I sighed, reflecting. My thoughts were tangled, unsure of what the decision would lead to. I suddenly realized that I was afraid not only of the physical exhaustion but also of the emotional strain. I feared how I would be perceived in Wanda's eyes, and I worried that her cold restraint would become unbearable for me. "I'm just worried about how things will be with your mom," I confessed. Durant didn't respond immediately. He leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. "I know that things with my mom can be a little complicated," he said at last. "But she's still my mother. Maybe things will change with the baby. You see, she could become different. Give her a chance." I felt that in his words there was not only hope but also a sense of inevitability. We both knew that our decision, whatever it was, would require patience and understanding. "Okay," I said, deciding to accept his suggestion. "But if things don't go as planned, we'll need a backup plan." The move to Durant's house happened faster than I expected. The old-fashioned house with high ceilings, creaky floorboards, and centuries-old windows became the next chapter of our life. Durant often said that this place held his childhood memories, but to me, it felt foreign and oppressive, as if the walls whispered of a past that had nothing to do with me. Still, I tried to focus on the positive, hoping that time and patience would change my perception. On the first day of our arrival, Wanda greeted us at the door with a broad smile on her face. As always, she seemed unnaturally kind to me, but I tried to hide my doubts. "Welcome home, Durant," she said, giving her son a tight hug, then turned to me, her voice softening. "And you too, Sylvia. I hope your stay here will be comfortable." The first few days seemed to go smoothly. Wanda cooked my favorite dishes, helped set up the baby's room, and even told me stories about Durant's childhood, as if the icy tension I had felt had melted away. But despite these kind gestures, I couldn't shake the feeling that her friendliness was merely a mask, hiding some cold, unexplored depth. One evening, when Durant and I were in the living room, Wanda joined us with a tray of hot cocoa and handed me a cup. She smiled and said, "You know, Sylvia, pregnancy really suits you. You look radiant." I smiled in response, feeling a sense of relief from her words. "Thank you, Wanda, and thank you for everything you're doing," I said, genuinely grateful for her attention and care. She nodded, her eyes full of gentle warmth. "It's the least I can do." "Family should take care of each other," she said, and her words sounded reassuring. But something in her gaze made me pause. Perhaps it was just a moment when her kind words sounded too mechanical, or maybe a subtle shadow of doubt slipped into her eyes, but I felt that things weren't as simple as they seemed. As each day passed and we settled into the old house, Wanda's sweet exterior, her outward kindness, began to crack. More and more often, I noticed how she watched me closely, her gaze becoming more intense, and every movement I made seemed to be under a microscope. When Durant was at work, it was usually just Wanda and I left together, and her behavior became increasingly odd. At first, I tried to brush off these thoughts, telling myself that my pregnancy hormones were making me overly sensitive. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Wanda's kindness was just a facade, and behind it was something much more unsettling. Wanda's behavior continued to shift, and it became more obvious when we were alone. One day, while I was preparing sandwiches in the kitchen, she unexpectedly walked in, looked at my choice of ingredients, and remarked, "You know, Durant always likes sandwiches with lots of mayo. But now, it seems like he's settled for less." I, a little embarrassed, replied that I didn't know that, and she shrugged. "You don't know much about my son." She always found ways to make such remarks that made me feel uncomfortable, as if I wasn't good enough for him, even in simple, harmless things like making food. Each day, the comments became more frequent. They were subtle jabs, disguised as concern, which seemed to grow harder and heavier to bear. I tried to ignore them, hoping that in time the tension would dissipate on its own. But one day, when I was resting in the living room, going through names for our future baby, Wanda approached me, sat beside me, and leaning in, quietly said, "You know, Sylvia, if only Durant had chosen someone better. Maybe someone more suitable for our family." I was stunned. My head buzzed, and I couldn't believe my ears. I tried to hide my confusion and asked, "What do you mean?" Wanda leaned even closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Let's be honest, you've struggled so much with this pregnancy, I wonder if you'll be able to handle what comes next." Her words felt like a knife slicing through my chest. I barely held back tears, feeling the inner pain tighten around my throat. "I'm doing my best," I whispered barely audibly, but inside, I was seething with indignation. I didn't understand why, instead of offering support, she kept trying to weaken me. Every interaction with her became increasingly difficult. I tried to avoid seeing Wanda, but she always found a way to invade my thoughts, like an inescapable fog. The house, which had once been a refuge, began to feel like a prison. And in this dark building, I felt more and more lonely and isolated. The only comfort was Durant's presence. When he was around, I felt safe, his warmth enveloping me, and everything seemed easier. But even with him, I didn't dare speak of my feelings, afraid it would cause a rift between him and his mother. The situation came to a head when Durant informed me that he would be away on a business trip for several days. His voice was filled with concern when he said, "Mom will be here with you, everything will be fine." He reassured me that everything would be okay, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something serious was about to happen. The night before he left, I overheard him talking to Wanda in the hallway. His words were urgent, full of anxiety. "Please, Mom, promise me you'll take care of Sylvia." Wanda's response was so sweet that it could have been mistaken for sincerity. "Of course, my dear, don't worry, I'll look after her." However, it was clear to me that this carefree phrase concealed something much darker. That night, as I went to bed, I felt how difficult it was to breathe, as if the room grew tighter and heavier with each passing hour. The next morning, after Durant left, the atmosphere in the house became even more suffocating. It felt like I was encountering an invisible wall in every room, behind which Wanda was lurking, ready to deliver another blow. I could no longer avoid these verbal attacks, but something always held me back, the feeling that if I said anything in response, I would irreparably damage my relationship with my husband's family. That's when it hit me. That day, I was sitting in our shared living room, browsing something on the internet, when I stumbled upon advice on how to deal with difficult family members. The consensus on the forums was clear: if someone is behaving manipulatively, you need to gather evidence. Those words sounded like a signal to take action. An idea came to me. I quickly ran to the store and bought a small voice recorder. If I could record Wanda's words, if I could capture her true nature, perhaps that would be the only way for Durrant to see who she really was. Perhaps that was the only way I could protect myself and, maybe in the future, protect our child. When I got back home, I found Wanda in the living room. She was sitting in an armchair, thoughtfully flipping through an old photo album, which seemed to have become her constant companion during these tense days. I didn't know what exactly she was searching for in these faded pictures, maybe peace from the memories or an attempt to justify her actions in the past. "Ah, Sylvia," she said, not lifting her eyes, "come look at these photos of David when he was young, so innocent and naive, like a child." Her voice was almost affectionate, but there was a trace of bitterness, as though it was hard for her to accept that this boy had grown up and chosen his own path. I sat down beside her, feeling the voice recorder pressing against my side. It was turned on, hidden, and invisible, like my inner protector. "He always recalls his childhood with love," Wanda continued, not taking her eyes off the pages of the album. I noticed she was smiling slightly, as though she was once again immersing herself in those days. I tried not to show that I couldn't listen to this stream of carefree memories laced with judgment, and I replied, "Yes, he often says his childhood was special." I didn't know how else to respond, trying to maintain neutrality, neither too blunt nor too shy. But Wanda already knew how to manipulate my words. Her half-smile didn't fade. "Well, he had a mother who cared for him, who knew how to raise a child properly," she continued, glancing at me with barely concealed disdain. I felt something tighten in my chest, but, trying not to reveal my emotions, I answered, "I'm sure we all do the best we can for our loved ones, Wanda." She only smirked, her voice becoming even colder and more venomous. Doing the best you can and knowing what's best are two completely different things. "I just hope my grandson doesn't suffer because of your inexperience." Those words fell on my ears like stones, each one echoing within me, but I kept my composure. "Thank you for the advice, Wanda," I said calmly, nodding, though a storm was rising inside me. Wanda had no idea that each of her snide remarks was now being recorded. It was so important to me. I was gathering evidence that could help me in the future when everything would come to light. The days stretched on, and the tension grew. I felt myself being pulled by this inner struggle, as if each day was a new trial. During this time, I began looking for a way out, a place where I could simply breathe. In my search for solitude, I came across an apartment nearby, a small, cozy place that felt like a true refuge. It was almost like an island in a sea of turbulent emotions. This place would be my salvation from Wanda's constant pressure. However, deep down, I knew this wasn't just an escape. It was more than a response to her attacks. It was a step toward the future, a future where I could perhaps be free, and most importantly, a future for my child. I hoped Durrant would learn the truth, see what had been happening behind his back, and understand that I couldn't remain silent. Several days had passed since his departure. Despite my efforts to keep my distance, Wanda continued to find ways to criticize me. She tried to test all my boundaries. One evening, after dinner, when I was in the living room looking through a baby name book, the very same list that Durrant had bought us with love, she approached me again. It had to be done carefully, I told myself. "Well, let's hear the options," Wanda said, sitting down on the sofa opposite me. Her voice sounded unexpectedly calm, almost encouraging. I sighed slightly and began. We're thinking about Beatty, if it's a girl, or Leon, if it's a boy. But as soon as I said these names, Wanda rolled her eyes and snorted. Beatty? That's a name for a pet. And Leon, it's so common, it's not even worth discussing. I felt my cheeks flush. These are just options we haven't decided on yet, I tried to argue. But Wanda, not listening, continued with a tone of disdain. You know, in our family, we have traditions. Durant was named after his grandfather. Maybe you should respect these traditions instead of picking random names out of a book. Her words were the final trap, tightening around my chest. I couldn't stay silent anymore. This was too much. Durant and I will choose our child's name together, I replied, trying to sound firm, but her reaction was instantaneous. Wanda stood up, angrily knocked the book from my hands, and, without holding back her fury, screamed. You're so ungrateful. I tried to help you, and all you do is ruin my son's life and his future. Her words were like shards of glass, tearing apart my last hopes for peace in the house. I was stunned. My breath caught, but I couldn't let myself leave. Her words lodged in my heart like a knife she had once again driven into me. Wanda, I never asked for your help, I managed to squeeze out, feeling the tears rising. All I wanted was a little peace. You just can't let go and let him live his life. At that moment, Wanda's face turned red, and her eyes filled with rage. She screamed, You ungrateful wretch. And without giving me a chance to say another word, she pointed to the door. Leave. I don't even want this child to be born. I tried to hold back my tears. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard I thought it would burst out. This was my home too, but Wanda gave me no chance. She was relentless, like a storm offering no shelter. I saw her, in a fit of rage, rummaging through my bag, grabbing my keys, and throwing them out the door without thinking of the consequences. I stood there in a daze, trying to understand what was happening, and I was stunned that even in this moment, she wouldn't let me go. I was breathing heavily, feeling my emotions overwhelm me, as if a whirlpool were pulling me into the unknown. It took me a few minutes to compose myself. I remembered the apartment I had rented, my refuge from all this madness. It was a place where I could start over, where there would be no Wanda, where there would be no tension or fear. I took out my bag, wiped my eyes, and looked at Wanda. Our eyes met. She was angry, but I could stay silent no longer. You may regret this, I said calmly, not waiting for a reply, quickly leaving and shutting the door behind me. It was clear that the front line had now officially been drawn. The next few days in the new apartment were a mix of peace and anxiety. I sat in silence, trying not to think about what had happened, but those memories kept returning, like sharp needles that endlessly pulled my thoughts in different directions. I missed Durant terribly, feeling his absence in every corner of the apartment. It was unbearably hard, but I tried to hold myself together. I worried about how he would react to everything that had happened, to the things Wanda had said, to my leaving. When he returned, would have to explain everything, but how? How could I explain what had been said when every moment seemed to be against me? The day of Durant's return finally came. I felt the phone vibrate in my hand. It was him. I looked at the message, just landed. I'll be home soon. Can't wait to see you. My heart raced, but I stayed as calm as I could. I replied, I'm at the new apartment. Call me when you get home. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed again. His name appeared on the screen, and I picked up. His voice was confused and anxious. Sylvia, why are you at the apartment? Where are all your things? Why aren't you home? I took a deep breath, trying to find the words to explain. Durant, there's a lot, you need to. My thoughts were tangled, and I didn't even know how to start. But his voice was insistent, waiting for my response. I continued, after everything, from the voice recordings to the final confrontation with Wanda. And silence fell on the other end of the line. It was almost tangible, suffocating. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said, and I felt my world begin to crumble and rebuild at the same time. 10 minutes later, as promised, he was standing in front of me. We drove back to the house. I was silent. I couldn't speak, because the words were stuck in my throat. When we entered, Wanda was already sitting in the living room, feigning surprise. Her face seemed calm, but I saw her tense as soon as she noticed us. "Durant, welcome back. Where is Sylvia?" Her voice sounded contrived, but calm. Durant didn't respond immediately. His eyes, when he looked at his mother, were ice cold. "She's here," he said shortly, then added, "and we heard everything you said." Wanda froze. I could see how she tried to suppress her fear, but it was evident in every movement. Durant walked over to the stereo system and played one of the recordings. I felt everything in the room change. Wanda's face turned pale as her own voice boomed in the silence. It was like a collision with reality from which there was no escape. When the recording ended, Durant's face reflected rage. "How could you, Mother? You say such things? You say this about my family? About our child?" His voice trembled, and I saw his hands clench into fists. Wanda's eyes darted around the room, looking for an excuse, but there was none. "Durant, you don't understand. I was trying to protect you," she began, but he wouldn't let her finish. "Protect me? By tormenting Sylvia, humiliating her? That's not protection, that's cruelty," he said, his anger growing with every word, but he didn't lose control. Wanda couldn't hold it in any longer and burst into tears. Her face twisted with pain, and she reached out to her son. "I only wanted what's best for you, Durant," her voice trembled with desperation. But Durant just shook his head. "Your version of a better world is not what I want for myself, for Sylvia, or for our child. You need to respect that." His words cut like a knife, and Wanda couldn't hide her pain. She continued crying, trying to reach him, but Durant stepped back, not allowing her to get closer. "I need some time, Mom," he said, his voice weary, and I felt how it all weighed on him, and on me too. He took my hand and led me out of the house. We drove back to the apartment. The rift between mother and son was evident, but at that moment, in our silence, shared only between us, our bond grew stronger. United against the deceit we had faced, the new apartment felt like a stark contrast to the house we had left. Unlike the luxury and grandeur of the old home, its walls were simple, devoid of any unnecessary embellishments, yet despite this, the atmosphere in the space was filled with a special warmth. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, filling the room with a soft glow. In this modest corner, with its unpretentious interior, there was something liberating, as if here we could let go of the weight of the past and take a new step, starting with a clean slate. This place became our refuge, a place where we could look toward the future without fear. Durant and I desperately needed a place where we could rebuild our lives, without looking back at everything that had come before. The changes ahead, including the birth of our child, required privacy, peace, and the certainty that nothing would now destroy what we were creating. And although the clouds hanging over us hadn't completely disappeared, it was important that we were together now, safe from the storms of the past. We set about what we considered important, arranging our things, starting to settle every detail. The second bedroom, as promised, was transformed into a nursery, with neutral-colored walls and furniture assembled piece by piece, eventually taking the shape of a cozy room for our baby. One day, as we were painting the walls, Durant said thoughtfully, "Given everything, this place feels more like home than that big house we used to live in." I smiled without looking up from the brush that left its marks on the wall. "Yes, it's smaller, but it feels warmer. There's something special about the atmosphere here," I replied, moving the shelf into place. Durant found a photo, carefully hidden in one of the old albums, the moment when we were happy newlyweds, completely unaware of the challenges that awaited us. Handing it to me, he said, "Look at us. We were so happy." I took the photo and looked at us, young, full of hope, surrounded by the fresh floral decorations of our wedding day. We had come a long way since then. And although we weren't who we were back then, it was important for me to realize that we had grown stronger. "We've really been through a lot, but it's only made us stronger," I said, adjusting his arm around me. I noticed that there was something like guilt in Durant's eyes, something painfully vague. "I still feel guilty, Sylvia. I thought that going back to my mother's house would be the solution, but it turned out I was wrong." I looked at him, meeting his gaze, and said calmly, "You're not to blame, Durant. We made this decision together, and now, after all this time, we're starting a new chapter. Together." We fell silent for a while, holding each other. We had been through so much, but what lay ahead was bright. Just as we began to accept this new path, an unexpected package arrived. No return address, only the name, Wanda, neatly written on the envelope. We looked at each other, unsure of what to expect from the surprise. Inside was a hand-knitted small baby blanket, with soft fur, incredibly cozy to the touch, and a small note written by her, which made me freeze in an instant. "I hope this helps improve our relationship," Durant whispered, reading aloud. He wasn't sure what to do with this gesture. I was uncertain too, but I still said, "It's a beautiful blanket, and I appreciate her effort." But Durant only nodded, looking at me with understanding. He knew that we needed to protect our world, our family, and that there had been too much pain in the past to go back. We decided we had to move forward, that what mattered most was what we were creating now. The blanket was a symbol of an attempt to restore something, but we knew we had to focus on the future. The imminent birth of our child became the beacon we were striving toward, every corner of the apartment filled with new hopes. Durant and I couldn't stop marveling at what we had, this little life we were nurturing, full of love and care. Being here, in our home, we began to forget all past grievances and focused on the bright future ahead. Our little daughter, Sophie, was a pride and joy, her tiny hands, her curious brown eyes with chestnut hair, a constant source of inspiration. She was growing and changing us, pulling our world along with her, the one that once seemed shattered. We believed she would be a symbol of our victories, of our new beginnings. Life didn't stand still. It went on, and with each passing day, we delved deeper into this family world, filled with laughter, joy, and the little cares that every parent knows. Time flew by quickly. Durant and I often looked at her late at night, while she slept, and couldn't believe that this miracle was the result of our decisions. Everything we had been through had led us here. We had done it together. One Sunday, while Sophie played on the mat, Durant suggested we go for a walk and then to the library, a place that had become significant to us. "How about showing Sophie where we met?" he said, smiling. I agreed, knowing that this day was special. Sophie and I went to the library, and standing there, among the shelves full of stories, Durant and I held her hand, repeating how we had once met there, and now, her story was beginning right there. We looked at each other, feeling a sense of completion in our hearts, yet with a longing for even more. We had been through so many struggles, but it was those struggles that had brought us to this moment, filled with happiness. We kept living, knowing that many more moments awaited us ahead, moments we would share together, as a family, and nothing would ever destroy what we had built.